My name is Balkan Devlen. I'm the director of Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and welcome to Inside Policy Talks, MLI's podcast series in which we explore different issues from domestic politics to energy to foreign policy and national security. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two dear friends and colleagues, Alexander Lanoszka, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, and Toms Rostoks, who is the director of the Center for Security and Strategic Research at the National Defense Academy of Latvia. Gentlemen, welcome. Today, as the NATO summit is going on in Washington, D.C., the 75th anniversary of the alliance, we would like to talk a bit about Canada's biggest deployment abroad, that is the mission Operation Reassurance in Latvia. The mission used to be called Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group Latvia, but as of July, it became the Multinational Brigade Latvia that comprised, I think, about 10 or 11 allies led by Canada as a framework nation in Latvia, and of course, naturally hosted by Latvia. The purpose is to provide deterrence and defense of the eastern flank of NATO. Toms and Alexander wrote a great paper, a great report detailing the evolution and the future of this mission back in April. We'll put a link to the report in the show notes down there. You can go and read it for Macdonald-Laurier Institute, called "Success Assured?" Appraising the Canadian-led Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia. So as the mission, as the summit is going on in Washington, D.C., we thought it would be a great idea to go back and visit that report and give our audience a sense of how this mission evolved, the importance of Canadian presence in Latvia, in the broader eastern flank of NATO, what that means, and why it is important for not only supporting and defending our allies, but why it is important for Canadian security and prosperity as well. So, without further ado, let me turn to Alexander, just to give the audience sort of a capsule understanding of how this particular mission evolved since Canada took over as the framework nation in 2017.
Well, I think we have to go a bit further back. The three Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania became NATO members in 2004. And although they received a significant political commitment by dint of joining the alliance back then, there was very little in the way of a military commitment that would help assure those countries of their territorial integrity and political sovereignty. There was simply the promise to come to their defense. And indeed, in the years following their accession to NATO, there were demands made on the part of at least Lithuania for there to be more firmer defense plans put in place in case something were to happen. But this was the 2000s. Even Vladimir Putin himself said on the occasion of their accession to NATO that their membership did not really concern Russia in view of the actual security environment and the new threats posed by terrorism elsewhere in the world. So when Russia did take Crimea and destabilize eastern Ukraine in 2014, that of course prompted calls for NATO to provide additional reassurance. Of course, before 2014, there were some measures implemented largely in response to what the Lithuanian president, Dalia Grybauskaitė, had mentioned or had wanted during the Obama years. But even so, there was a perceived insufficiency of what NATO would actually provide militarily to those three Baltic countries, in addition to Poland and other countries of the eastern flank. There was the Wales Summit in 2014, where the alliance agreed upon various measures, including the very high response to VJTF, the very high response joint task force, but no one understood what exactly it meant. And so in the subsequent NATO summit in 2016, they decided to encourage or implement rather more tangible deterrence measures, and that indeed what took the form of the enhanced forward presence, whereby the United Kingdom, United States, Germany, and Canada would be the framework nations for Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, respectively. Framework nation simply means that those 4 countries provide the military backbone to the battalion-sized battle group deployed in each country. And so over the course of the following years...
At this stage, could you give a sense of what a battalion size looked like?
Sure. So, but according to NATO nomenclature, a brigade would be about 1,000 military personnel. In practice, the battalion-sized battle groups would vary between 800 to 1,200 military personnel. The Latvian deployed battle group would be amongst the largest, in part because it was actually the most multinational of the 4. And so the 4 battle groups were generally successful insofar as there were no hybrid threats that would come in the direction in the subsequent years. Some of the analytical ranks in the late 2010s had warned of EFP battle groups being the target of riots, of various forms of subversion and disinformation campaigns. There was some of that in the years between 17 and 2022, but there were manageable security challenges indeed with respect to the Canadian-led battle group in Latvia. The embassy had taken a very proactive approach to ensure that different stakeholders in Latvian society would come to accept and even welcome the battle group. But come the military buildup that Russia had undertaken over the course of 2021, and of course, in the advent of the full-scale invasion on the 24th of February, 2022, there was a real perceived sense of insufficiency as to the makeup and the numbers involved with each of the battle groups. Already, of course, there were some concerns that these battle groups were simply speed bumps, as it were, to any determined Russian assault. But in the context of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the alliance eventually agreed to reinforce those battle groups. They had already started to do so towards the end of 21, early 2022. But the Madrid summit in 2022, then the alliance had made the definitive decision to upgrade those battle groups from being a battalion size to a brigade size, which would mean about 4,000 military personnel, more or less.
Oh, excellent! And just one note for the audience: Alexander wrote a piece for MLI again a few years back called "The Unsung Song" regarding the Canadian deployment in EFB as a success story that is unfortunately not as well known in Canada as it should be. So for those who are interested, should go and have a look at that as well. Toms, over to you with regards to how sort of both the experience in Latvia with the decisions initially taken to create these groups, and then why that matters for Latvia, and how it evolved in a broader sense, both as the battle group is formed and Canada takes the lead, the perceptions within Latvia, both in terms of security, but also the public perceptions of the battle group, and particularly with regards to the Canadian role in it, and how it evolved over time. Give us a little bit of a sense of how that went.
Well, the Baltic states in general have wanted to have a substantial NATO presence on their territories since 2004, when we joined NATO. For many years, that was not a possibility, even for hosting larger military training exercises with participation of allies was somewhat kind of problematic because too many allies took into consideration Russia's sensitivities. Things obviously changed after 2014, and this is really when it finally became possible for the Baltic states, Latvia included, to push for rotational NATO military presence in the Baltic states. So Canada's contribution has been well received. Although back in 2016, when the decision was announced, and it was announced they would be Canada, there was a little bit of Canada is not necessarily kind of a natural choice to provide the backbone for the FP battle group, because it's across the Atlantic, and obviously there are similarities. We love ice hockey, and the climate is somewhat comparable. But then there were questions asked about Canada being the framework nation. But the overall experience with Canada's military contribution has been very positive. Although over time we have also kind of learned a bit more about Canada's domestic debate on security and defense, and a lot of analysts, yourself included, being quite critical about Canada's contribution as well. So we're also in the process of learning, but then kind of making this transition after the Madrid summit. So Latvia fought hard before the Madrid summit for the battle group to become a brigade eventually. And we're very glad that our allies, and obviously Canada being a key partner in this case, we're very glad that Canada agreed to increase its military contribution to the battle group. But we also understand the limitations. So Canada's contribution, well, at the start in 2017, it was about, I think, 450 troops. It will increase to 2,200 eventually, and that's we understand that this is a significant contribution by Canada. It is also, and kind of going back to the domestic debates in Canada, whether Canada will be able to sustain this level of military involvement. That's a very significant question. But also, I think we're not just talking about Canada, and this is where the strength of the battle group is its very international character, because we have Italians, Spanish, Poles, and so altogether about 10 or 11 nations involved. And because of Sweden's accession to NATO, there will be also a Swedish battalion that will make a contribution to Latvia's security. So overall, it's very positive. Also on the level of society, there have been no scandals involving Canadian troops, or if there were, those have not been public. I mean. There would always be minor issues, but there have been no major issues at all. And Canadian military personnel have been, they've been outstanding. Also, when it comes to communication, but we should also take into consideration that there were a couple of years when this public outreach wasn't really possible. So during COVID years, public outreach was not really an option. So that actually might have made it easier for Canadian troops to sort of avoid this public scrutiny. But all in all, I think Canada has done an outstanding job. Given the limitations in terms of financing capabilities and troops.
No, that's excellent. Now, actually, that's the point I want to get to. And first start with you, Alexander. On so last year in July, right before the NATO summit in Vilnius, a roadmap was announced between Canada and Latvia on how to get to that brigade level, which 2,200 eventually in 2026. in troop numbers is one part of it, but there were other commitments that are made in that roadmap. So, Alexander, maybe we can start with you and say, so what were the sort of the broader, not necessarily this many tanks and that many air defense systems sort of thing, but what are the commitments that Canada need to fulfill in order to bring it up? What kind of commitments that Canada need to fulfill to make it a capable, effective fighting force that this brigade needs to be, and that was announced in the roadmap? And how is that going? Because we know that announcing is one thing, implementation is another, and unfortunately the government is very good at announcements, but not so much in implementation. How is that going? What was the broader sort of category of things that have been announced, and how is the implementation of that roadmap going? And you think we will get there by this given deadlines or not?
So one of the bigger announcements was in relation to short range air defense systems purchased from Sweden that would provide force protection to the battle group in Latvia. There are, of course, other pieces of military hardware to which you alluded just earlier that relate to heavy armor, self-propelled howitzers, and so forth. Those would all be very much essential. The bigger question, of course, relates to personnel numbers. The numbers on paper do not seem to be that much, at about 2,200, as you said, military personnel that Canada would deploy. But the Canadian Armed Forces more generally has a personnel problem. In particular, its ability to recruit and to retain personnel. Recruitment has been a problem. It's fallen far short of its targets in recent years. Even though there may be many applicants, they do not seem to be processed in time. Retention has become a problem, in part because years of underinvestment and, frankly, the lack of new capabilities has created significant morale issues. On top of those constraints, the Canadian Armed Forces are being increasingly used in emergency domestic situations, such as wildfires. Those are very dangerous missions. And as much as the Canadian Armed Forces would be deployed where the Minister of Defense, or for that matter, the Prime Minister's office, would ask it to be deployed, the truth of the matter is that does create strain within the ranks of the Canadian Armed Forces. These are not the sorts of missions that many who have enlisted have signed up to do. They want to go abroad. Fighting forest fires is extremely dangerous. And the reason why the Canadian Armed Forces has been called upon to undertake those sorts of missions is because Canada has neglected forest management and so forth. Other capability gaps have created new capability gaps. And as much as the Canadian government has been very vocal about how the deployment in Latvia is shielded from these larger pressures that face the Canadian Armed Forces, it really strains credulity, quite frankly, that the deployment would be immune from such pressures. Unfortunately, there were news reports that came out about last year to the effect that Canadian military personnel had to purchase equipment from Amazon or had to exchange various pieces of hardware, personnel hardware, from their Danish counterparts. Canada is a very prosperous country. It's a G7 country, so it is embarrassing when these sorts of news reports get publicized. They should be publicized, in part because I think it calls attention to these shortfalls, but nevertheless, it is embarrassing that they're happening to begin with. So the ambition is there. The government has been very keen on reassuring Latvia, members of the Canadian public, and so forth, that the mission will continue and will not be hamstrung by any of those difficulties. But considering the recruitment, retention, and morale problems that do confront the Canadian Armed Forces, it's hard to think that the deployment will be immune from those pressures, especially after 2026.
No, I think that's a very important point. And just to give a little bit of a sort of a context for the audience, and you guys can go ahead and correct me if I'm wrong, but the general thinking tends to be, 1/3 of a force is deployed, 1/3 sort of recovers from the deployment, and 1/3 trains, right? So once you start, particularly extending the existing force for non sort of military deployment tasks, such as, for example, domestic operations for fighting wildfires, etc., that reduces time for training, that reduces time for rest and recapture, and reduces the ability to deploy forces. It means less training. It means things that they are doing that they're not necessarily trained for, and they don't have time to do things that they're trained for, etc., which leads to all issues about morale, about retention and recruitment. So there's the recruitment component, as when you try to do so many things with a limited force, and you cannot attract more people to do those other things, then you actually put a lot of pressure, and it creates a vicious cycle of its own. And that's on the one hand. So there is the personnel issues, and there is no quick answer to that, right? Even including last year's decision to enable the permanent residents to join Canadian Armed Forces was met with a lot of bureaucratic inertia and roadblocks and red tape, and eventually, I don't remember the exact numbers, but we're talking about 50,000 people or something like that applied, and 74 started, something around those lines, because security clearances take 18 months, and nobody waits for that. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, then we have the capabilities component that you highlight, right? Enablers to enable for the Canadian Armed Forces personnel to do the job that they are sent to do. To protect themselves and to protect our allies and be an effective fighting force, and that require having all those other enablers, be it short-range air defense systems, heavy armor, in electronic warfare, etc., etc. So
one thing I would add is that we gave quite a bit of equipment to Ukraine, including Leopard tanks, as well as M777 self-propelled howitzers. We have not made any announcement to replace those capabilities. I'm totally fine with giving those capabilities to Ukraine. In fact, I think we should give more. There's a greater marginal benefit for Ukraine to have them.
Absolutely.
That being said, we're not replacing those capabilities that we're giving away. Moreover, as you and I keep emphasizing on social media, Canada has only very modestly increased its ammunition production since 2022. I think to the tune of maybe 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000, in part because the Canadian government has balked at the price tag asked of the defense industry, which is to the tune of $400 million. That sounds like a lot of money, but if you consider that Stellantis and Volkswagen received $27 billion of direct subsidies from the Canadian government in the last 2 years, it's really not that much. But that is the decision made by the Canadian government. And so we're hamstring ourselves. We're still doing it. And unfortunately, I don't really see ourselves digging out of these capability gaps or capability holes, as it were, in the foreseeable future.
And I think that's a very important point to emphasize, because it is fundamentally a political decision. It's a prioritization issue, and it's very clear that the current government does not prioritize defense. There are everything else but defense. And this is not only us saying it. This is people who were in like Andrew Leslie, for example, who have been very local, who was a former general and a former Liberal member of Parliament, and others highlighting that. Mark Garneau, former foreign minister, had a very scathing interview just last week about the government not paying attention to these issues, etc. So it is an important political decision that needs to be done, but it has to be done now, as you pointed out, because it takes time to get these capabilities and deploy them. And just saying that we will do it when the time comes is not going to be enough, because once you're making a promise, you need to be able to deliver that promise. And I think it's important for Canadian credibility, for Canadian security, as well as the security and defense of our allies, that once we deploy those forces, we provide them the necessary tools. And we not only say that we will, but we will actually do the necessary things and put the money where our mouth is, to be able to get that. Toms, I want to turn to you in terms of, so once the roadmap is announced, that also included a bunch of things that Latvia needed to do to prepare to go from 1,200 troop numbers to about 4,000 to 5,000. So it's a big expansion. What Latvia has been doing and how that goes, and give us a sense of the Latvian side of preparing the ground for getting to the brigade level.
Well, Latvia has to do its homework as well, but really I think that it will be good to emphasize the different trajectories that the three EFP battle groups have taken from in Lithuania, the Lithuanian-German partnership, with its disagreements as well about who will be paying for what. I think there have been less disagreements in that regard when it comes to Latvian and Canadian partnership, because I think that Canada takes largely pays for the infrastructure that it's building at this point. Let's say soldiers' barracks at Ādaži base have been largely covered by Canadian government, and also the headquarters of the Canadian-led brigade. That's also on Canada. What Latvia has been doing on its part is that first of all, there was this big announcement in July, early July, 2 years ago, right after the Madrid summit, that there will be a new military base, Salonia. It will be the largest military training ground in the Baltic states. And that might very well be true at some point. It's just that it will be the training ground. It will not be the place where Canadian troops will be stationed. They'll be deployed there for military training, but apart from that, they'll be let's say stationed elsewhere, closer to capital city Riga. So, but that still is something that the Latvian government should do, because this military base would require a very, very substantial investment, and this comes at a time when the government is already kind of spending a lot on various infrastructure projects. So, for example, in the preceding weeks, there's been a lot of information about the financial trouble surrounding the Rail Baltica project, so the railway line that will be connecting the three Baltic capitals with the rest of Europe through Poland. And it seems that this large infrastructure project will cost 3 or 4 times more than originally predicted. Well, surprise, surprise, right? It has never happened, and now again, right? So, and it means that on the one hand, there's no shortage of funding for national defense purposes. So Latvia is already spending this year upwards of 3% of GDP on defense. If we count also the amount of money, several hundred million euro per year, that goes towards, that is paid towards air defense system. Building infrastructure, that's something that Latvia should do. But also, I think that that Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine also taught Latvia that we should shoulder a larger share of the burden ourselves. I mean, our allies are reliable, but given the scale of fighting in Ukraine, we should have a larger defensive force. So to that end, again, 2 years ago, it was announced that Latvia will transition back to conscription. And conscription has been reintroduced, but we are currently, let's say, the number of conscripts per year, I think this year it's just 600, many of them volunteers. The aim obviously would be to transition to several thousand conscripts per year, but again, there's an issue of infrastructure there. And our state defense concept, it stipulates that in peacetime, Latvia's military should be about 30,000 troops strong, and in wartime it should be 60,000. So 30,000 would be the reserve, and we are on our way to those numbers, but it may take longer than expected. So obviously, kind of we're moving in the right direction, but it may just take longer than expected to get there.
No, I mean that's important. It's also highlight. These are bigger projects. These are important both on the Canadian side and the Latvian side. That's why there will be problems, there will be issues, there will be roadblocks, there will be delays. Any large projects are probably not. But it's important to be able to. That's why it's important to start yesterday. And the next time is today, because they will come. You cannot have Amazon next day delivery when it comes to military preparedness and getting ready for it. And that's why it requires, and I think it's very clear in the Latvian case, and I think the political elite and policymakers have a very clear understanding of the threat. That seems to be a bit lacking here in Canada. I want to ask you both the last question, because we're coming to an end here. In terms of the future of the missions in broadly, sort of the in three Baltic states and Poland and also Romania and Bulgaria as well. Where do you see the future of the multinational brigade going, particularly when it comes to the ones in the Baltics? As you pointed out, it has to be thought as a single sort of a theater of operations, and the cooperation and interoperability between different battle groups, brigades in the Baltics will be extremely important. You cannot have a weakness in one, because that will create problems, security problems for others. That's why it is important that Canada actually put the enablers and necessary capabilities there. So it's not only about the defense of Latvia, but also defense of other Baltic states as well, etc. How do you see the future for the brigades, and particularly, Alexander, especially to you, how do you see the Canadian commitments going forward? What are what's your projection looking at the next 3 to 5 years? And same story for you, Toms. So let me start with Alexander and then get to you, Toms.
I'm not sure if people expected the battle groups to remain as long as they have when they were first deployed in 2017 and first announced in 2016 at the Warsaw Summit. I think the decision on the part of the Baltic countries, as well as Poland, to create a system of fortifications along their border with Russia, or for that matter with Belarus, is a step in the right direction, precisely because it increases the balance of probabilities, or improves the balance of probabilities in their favor. I think this is a lesson learned from the experience of the Russo-Ukrainian War, whereby fortification seems to matter a great deal, whether with respect to how Russia is able to defeat Ukrainian counteroffensives, as well as where Ukraine is best able to defend itself against Russian assault. So I think the multinational battle groups will remain in place for a while. I think, though, there needs to be an appetite for overturning the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We did not discuss it whatsoever, but one of the reasons why the battle group was fairly limited in size, as well as the fact that it's based primarily on rotational deployments as opposed to permanent ones, is to remain in faithful compliance with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which prescribes any permanent stationing of significant numbers of combat forces in the territory of those rather new NATO countries. So moving towards permanency would be a good thing, if only because rotational deployments create a lot of strain and create unpredictability for a number of the military personnel involved in those missions. There is some movement in that direction. I think even in the case of Germany, although they're sticklers with respect to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, they're making these sorts of moves towards permanency as regards to the Lithuanian deployment. Canada should probably think something similar. Thankfully, in the Canadian case, Task Force Latvia has been a really adept innovation made by the Department of National Defense in conjunction with the embassy in Riga to smooth out any transition that happens when a new rotation comes into deployment in Latvia. So there is already some institutional mechanisms in place to regularize the deployments, but I think there ought to be more of them. And as those countries think about fortification along the eastern frontier, the Baltic Defense Line, in the case of the three Baltic countries, Tarczów Wschód, or Eastern Shield, in the case of Poland, there needs to be some thought given as to how those fortifications relate to not just the regular forces of those individual countries, but also to the multinational battle groups. This is an interesting opportunity to think about connectivity between different systems. Those fortifications should be loaded with sensors that can increase early warning, that can improve command control, and thus can also be used in conjunction with the multinational forces that would be fighting if the unfortunate contingency were ever to arise. There is a tendency of thinking that battle groups could be skirted, that in some cases, if Russia were to attack, it can move around those battle groups. Think of Tapa in the case of Estonia. A tripwire only works if the aggressor actually trips over it. But having a fortification not only buys time, but does provide a hindrance to those forces that could enable the multinational battle group to go about any counteroffensive to reclaim any lost territory or to hold the line, as it were.
No, excellent. I'll get back to Toms in a minute, and then I actually want to give the last word to Alexander again, just to wrap up with why this matters to Canada and Canadians and Canadian security. Why are we there? Component. I want to end on that one. But two quick things. One, we have been talking about this for with Alexander a lot on social media. I mean, my feelings about the Russia NATO Founding Act is that it has to be scrapped, and we should have permanent deployments in the eastern flank, including deployment of nuclear weapons, and think on those terms, because it's kind of clear that that's just not going to go. And the rotational component is important. And just for the audience again, regular deployments is 6 months, and the first month and the last month is getting in and getting out. So you're effectively getting about 4 months, maybe 3.5 months of doing this stuff and working and training together with 10, 11 other nations, etc. And most of the troops end up doing 3, 4, maybe more deployments as a result. Yes, it will have its own challenges logistically, housing a larger number of people for long term, etc., etc. But it would also have a lot of positives, including the ability to bring families, fostering even closer ties between Canada and Latvia, etc. So I think a permanent deployments also needs to be part of this thinking. Toms, over to you. How do you see the future of the battle group?
Yeah, well, it's good that Alexander emphasized the rotational character of these deployments, and I do remember that at some point in one of our conversations, some time ago, probably even before COVID, we were wondering, whether about 10 years into future, Canada and other contributing nations would still be doing the same rotational contributions. And it seems that the answer is yes, but on a larger scale, which makes it even more ironic. Not necessarily kind of bad or problematic, but kind of interesting that this is happening. And well, from Latvia's perspective, I think that I don't see any concerns that the Latvian side would think that the brigade would be an unattainable dream. So it is happening, and it will happen in the coming years. So that brigade will be real in a sense. But we should also keep in mind that that's a peacetime contribution. And in a wartime, let's say Canada's ability to reinforce its military presence and resupply it would be severely restricted. I do think that this has been taken, kind of considered in NATO defense plans. Then sustaining the effort might be somewhat challenging as well. I think that until this far, no nation has dropped out of the Canadian-led battle group. Well, one of the nations may drop out by the end of this year, but then it's not just that Canada's contribution has been a success, but also kind of keeping the whole thing together has been also really good. And then there are a couple of other things. So. One thing that I'd like to mention is that, let's say, the brigade and the Latvian military should be able to work in concert, and that depends on the capabilities, interoperability, and training that the two sides receive. And it is somewhat concerning that some of the top-of-the-shelf capabilities that Latvia has procured. They will arrive in 2027, let's say. So IRIS-T air defense systems, it will take a few years for them to materialize. HIMARS systems from the US, that may take a few years as well. Most likely we have the time, but, well, unless the Russians think otherwise, right? And then, the last point that I'd like to emphasize is that we are focusing on the Canadian-led brigade, but then it's the alliance that deters Russia, not necessarily 10, 11, or 12 nations. And also, I think last year there was a decision taken at Vilnius NATO summit that there will be rotational air defense presence in the Baltic states, and that is starting to happen. So the Dutch will be deploying their Patriot system to Lithuania for an exercise, but I think that more of this stuff needs to happen. In Latvia we have the Spanish deployed NASAMS system, but yeah, its range is quite limited, and for the purpose of let's say being able to fully engage Russia in case of a military conflict, more of these high-end rotational systems should rotate through the Baltic states, and this should be happening yesterday, I would say.
Alexander?
Yeah. Tom just reminded me of something that I think listeners need to hear. Russian units based in Pskov, which is near the border with Estonia and Latvia, as well as those in Kaliningrad, have suffered tremendous attrition. It's difficult to overstate how much attrition they have suffered. That's good news for us in the sense that it buys time to recapitalize our militaries, as well as to field those forces that we need to go about proper defense. After all, Russia has shown itself to be rather resilient in reconstituting many of its units that have suffered tremendously high attrition rates. They're overly committed, of course, in Ukraine, but the fact of the matter is those units have suffered attrition. Russia has shown itself to be able to reconstitute those units. It will take time for those units to be of fighting quality, especially against a NATO adversary. So we ought to use that time. And as what we've been saying throughout this episode, military power does not come overnight. It takes many, many years to go about a proper recapitalization. Poland has been doing it for 10 years, and it's maybe just starting to field a proper military. Canada, unfortunately, has fallen way back. And so to your question that I didn't quite answer earlier about the future of the Canadian commitment, Canada needs to really get its act together and start thinking about it now. We do have this window of opportunity thanks to Russia's overcommitment to Ukraine and high attrition rates, but I don't see us using it. The defense policy update has called for new spending only after 2025, which is when the election will be held, and it looks like the Conservatives are going to have a very large majority. So whatever the Liberal government promises, it almost doesn't matter. So I would say that there needs to be a plan made in the Conservative political party to go about thinking through Canada's posture and hit the ground running when they do come to power by the fall of next year.
No, I think this is a great point to get to the last point I want to ask Alexander. We're going to end there. In a minute or two, what this means for Canada and Canadian security. Why are we there? And just to re-emphasize the message that how this contributes to Canada as a new government coming through, and as we will have an election at some point in the next 16 months or so. Why it matters?
Canada has done a terrible job in publicizing its own success story in Latvia. There is a reluctance to talk about it for whatever reason. Even in the 2021 election, when Justin Trudeau was rightly criticized for his handling of the Afghan withdrawal, he could have pointed to the success of the Latvian deployment, but for whatever reason chose not to do so. And I think it just goes to show that it's not in their DNA to talk through defense matters. And so there is that reluctance. Canada is in Latvia because Canada has a lot of stake in the, dare I say, rules-based international order. I think one does exist. Canada has benefited tremendously from it. Has a very globalized economy. It has much to lose if Europe were to fall to despotism. If Russia were to take large portions of European territory, that's going to have implications for Canadian economic prosperity. And we have seen over the course of the 20th century that European security is integrally tied with that of North American security. We're in the missile age, and indeed, threats can travel fairly quickly over great distances. Russia does not need to have the capability to invade Canada per se for it to be a threat. And as such, Canada has good reasons to be part of the enhanced forward presence. It's also an ally, and it's in Canada's interest, of course, to have that seat at the table. So, but again, Canada has been derelict in going about acquiring capabilities in the last decade or so, and the present government does not really seem to be interested in obtaining 2%. Defense Minister Bill Blair has even acknowledged that members of his cabinet do not understand 2% and do not understand its importance. I think that's a massive failing on the part of that political party. They've had, at least since 2015, to get smart on international security. They have not. And so I'm not very optimistic in that regard. But there is, I think, a deeper issue in Canadian politics. Leaders just do not seem to care that much. And I don't think it's because voters reward their insouciance. I think they would care if shown the proper leadership on this file. Hopefully, there will be some leadership to come.
No, excellent. That's an excellent point to highlight, in the sense that the sober reality that Canadian security and prosperity heavily depends on the security and prosperity of our friends and allies, and the institutions and the alliances that we are embedded in, that enable the lifestyle and the well-being and the wealth that we enjoy in this country. And it is important to defend that, because if we don't defend it, when the threats are over the horizon, we will have to defend it here. And I think it's important to highlight that. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much to both of you. The paper is, again, at the MLI's website, Success Assured, Appraising the Canadian-led Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia. Go ahead and read. We could have talked another hour, but we will end it here, and talk to you next time.